Okay, so we're looking at February, March of 2015. It's question 2.3. It says, study the diagram of a reflex arc below. All right, the first thing to do when you have a question or a diagram would be to label all of the different parts. It's just going to make it much more easier for you to answer the questions, right? So we'll start with part A. What would part A be? You can see that's a neuron. Right, who's going to give us the answer there? Part A, sensory neuron, that's correct, right? And then part B, that's the interneuron, correct, good. Part D, right, synapse, good. And then part C, there's only one neuron that's left, and that's the motor neuron, right? Correct, good. Okay, so if we look at the diagram, right, we try and analyze what's there before we get to the question, right? It will make it much more easier for us to answer the questions. There's something here. What would this be? What I'm highlighting there. It's not labeled, but that structure would represent what? You can see that it could, Abrar has the receptor, right? So that's the receptor. This A, we know it's the sensory neuron, and there's three ways in which we can see that it's the sensory neuron, right? One is the direction, which is given by the arrow. Since the impulse is traveling towards the spinal cord, right, towards the central nervous system, that shows you that it's a sensory neuron. Secondly, we find that the cell body is somewhere in the middle. That's another sign that it's the sensory neuron. Thirdly, it's entering through the top, right? The top side of the spine is known as the dorsal. Like anyway, in life sciences, when we talk of the top side, we talk of dorsal. So it enters in the dorsal side, and that's another sign that it's a sensory neuron. But then there'll be a synapse. We've got a motor neuron, which is within this gray matter of the spinal cord. There's a central canal also there in the center there of the spinal cord. Then we have another synapse here, which we've identified. Then we have the motor neuron. We can see this is the motor neuron. One is the cell body is in the start of the neuron. There'll be a few dendrites and then the cell body. And then we've got the direction of flow is away from the cell, from the central nervous system, which tells you that that's the motor neuron. And thirdly, it exits through the ventral root at the bottom. So that's another sign that we're looking at the motor neuron there. Okay, so we get now to the questions, right? The first question is saying, what is a reflex action? Right, so that basically we're asking you to define a reflex action here. And as we go along, you can see what's the next question. So you can start typing your answer in advance, right? Which will just speed up things a bit. Okay, so good. We've got some answers there. A quick automatic response to a stimulus from Katlego, right? That's perfect, right? And then Abrar is saying a rapid involuntary action in response to a stimulus. Now you'll see that their definitions are different, but it's saying exactly the same thing, right? Instead of quick, he's saying rapid, which is the same thing. And then to say automatic and involuntary is also the same thing, right? And then they've got the response to a stimulus. So that's all we need for this answer there for the 2 marks, okay? Then if you say 2.3.2, label the following. Functional connection D, we've already done that, which is the synapse, and then neuron B, which we said was the interneuron. Okay, so if we check the memo, right, we've got a reflex action is a rapid automatic response to a stimulus. And then we had the part labeled the synapse D, and the neuron was the interneuron. Okay, if you go back to the question, it says, state the significance of the functional connection at D. Right, so when they're saying give the significance, why is it important? Basically, it's requiring from you to give the function. So what's the function of a synapse. Okay, it joins two neurons. That's correct, but I don't think that's in the memo, right? It's the kind of a description to say that it joins two neurons. It's a microscopic gap where two neurons join. That's more of a description of what the synapse is, right? Then when you want the significance, why is it important? Abrar is saying it ensures that the impulse travels in one way only, right? Iram has the same thing, that's fine. And there are many other answers also, right? So I'll show you the memo. We also had it in the notes when we learned the work there in the video, right? So it ensures that the impulse moves in one direction only. That's what was said is correct. It prevents continuous stimulation of the neurons. It ensures that the impulse is transmitted from the sensory to the motor neurons. When you said it goes in one direction, it's basically saying the same thing again there, right? That's enough. They gave you a few options there. Okay, then 2.3.4. Write down the correct order of the letters only of the neurons involved from the time the stimulus is received until a response takes place, right? So what would the answer be there, right? Ram says A, B, D, and okay, and then C, Kaleko is A, B, C, right? So if you look here, it's going to go sensory neuron, interneuron, it will jump D, the synapse, and then go to the motor neuron. If we look at the memo, it's asking you for the letters of the neurons, right? So D, the synapse is not classified as a neuron. Okay, so that wouldn't be part of the answer there, right? So ABC is enough in the memo. And I think if you had D, if I recall properly from the marking processes, I don't think that they penalized you if you had D in that process, right? As an extra one. Okay, so we go back there. It says, explain the consequence for the reflex action. What will happen for a reflex action if neuron C is damaged? Neuron C, we know, is the motor neuron. So explain means say why. What's going to happen if the motor neuron is damaged? How will that affect the whole reflex action? So if you understand it, in a way, it links to the previous question that we said the flow will be from neuron A, the impulse will then be transferred to neuron B and then neuron C. Now, what's going to happen if neuron C is damaged and can't do its function? So how will that affect this reflex action? Okay, the person will not be able to respond, right? And to a stimulus received. So we've got what we needed there, right? The stimulus will be received and it will travel to the spinal cord, right? So A and B, there's nothing wrong with it. So it's going to move from the receptor to the spinal cord. But then because neuron C is damaged, it cannot go away now, right? And if it can't go to, what would the structure that I'm highlighting there be now called? That is a one-word answer there. Right, the effector, good Katlego and Abrar had that. Right, so it's the effector. So obviously now the impulse cannot go from the spinal cord to the effector because motor neuron label C is being damaged. And as a result, there'll be no response now. Okay, right, so the person will be able to receive the stimulus, but they won't be able to respond to it. Okay, then the last one said draw a label diagram to represent the structure of neuron A. So we needed to know, okay, neuron A is a sensory neuron. Okay, now with that, they obviously need more detail. Now, in this case, you were lucky to an extent that you had this drawing which could have guided you there. Right, from the diagram, you could take out this part of diagram A, but now we need it to be labeled there, obviously. Okay, so you'll redraw this, but you'll go into a bit more detail. And it's important that you have the drawing skill. And that's why you'll find in class, sometimes we give you homework where you need to draw certain structures and the functions because they can ask you in an exam to do something like this here, right? So we had one learner sent me their diagram right? If we look at it here, this would be correct. What's the labels, right? One thing that I wouldn't like from this diagram would be that you have arrows, right? Normally we won't put arrows. Your label line shouldn't be an arrow, should just be a line. When there's an arrow, it normally shows that something is moving from one place to another, right? So an arrow is used to show movement. Here you just use a line, we'll take out that arrowhead from there. Now if we go to the labeling, uh, can you see my mouse moving, right? Okay, then also I don't like this way. The line, your label line, if you're labeling something, this label is not touching the structure that you want to show. Right? Touch the structure that you want to show. So synapse is a microscopic gap, maybe the gap there. There should be a line also in the middle where the line of the page is here. There should be a line going across here, right? And that's, remember we said that the nerves work like cables. So we said that in a cable, you'll have the copper wire inside and you've got the insulation around it. Okay, so some of the labels, this one is correct here at the bottom, the myelin sheath, which is now around the inner part. Then, okay, I'll start you on the left hand side, right? When we're drawing this, you should, it's recommended when you're drawing a neuron to put an arrow to show the direction of the impulse, right? That in this case, it's from left to right. So you start on this side. These are part of the dendrites, and then the dendrite would carry on inside of here, right? And let me just see. Okay, sorry. It's labeled on the side. So that's why in this case here, that's why I'm saying it's difficult if you don't have an arrow to show where to start from. But because you've labeled the receptor on the right-hand side, that would mean that we're going to start on the right and it's going to the left. That's the direction of the impulse from right to left in this case, right? So the dendrites would be here. And then the dendrites start here. They continue inside here until you reach this part. This entire structure would be called what? It's the cell body label, right? Good. And then this circle within that, what would that be called now? The circle within the cell body. Okay, so we've got the myelin sheath. We said we've got the dendrite in the middle. Okay, good. It is labeled here, but I just make your own line. Okay, there. Good. We've got the answer that this circle here inside represents the nucleus within the cell body, and you'll have a cytoplasm also. And then the axon, this line should be going down to touch this line in the middle, right? Which is the axon. Now, if you look here, the dendrite and the axon is exactly the same thing. The difference being that the dendrite is before the cell body. So the wire that's carrying the impulse before the cell body is known as the dendrite. And once you pass the cell body now, going towards the left, it's now the same thing that's now called the axon, basically. Okay. If we're marking this, cell body 1 mark, myelin sheath another mark, dendrite and a third mark. Axon, I wouldn't give it because the label line is not touching what it's supposed to. I think synapse is not in the memo there, right? Receptor, I'm not sure if it's in the memo. What's missing here? I don't remember, it's a picture. Maybe there's something that's cut off, but there's something that's missing that should be in every diagram that you draw. Remember, this is like a crop picture, so I'm just assuming that maybe there's something that's missing. Good, a caption, right? So we need to have a caption. What would be a suitable caption for this? Right, who can give us what should be the caption of this? Diagram of a sensory neuron, perfect, right? Good. So that would be a compulsory mark. Generally, if you have to draw something like this, there'll be 1 mark for the caption to say diagram of a sensory neuron, 1 mark. And then 1 mark that you drew the correct structure. And then the other 3 marks would have been for the labels. That's the normal way marks would have been distributed in a paper like this, right? In this case, because the diagram of a sensory neuron was given to you in the stop diagram, you were basically redrawing it, just kind of zooming into it a bit more, right? They didn't expect you to make a mistake there. So you'll find that when you look at the memorandum here, they're giving you 1 mark for the caption, just to say a sensory neuron or an afferent neuron. Remember, they didn't tell you what it was in the diagram. In the diagram, it was labeled as structure A, right? And in this case, the direction of the impulse, it's something that is recommended to show. There wasn't a mark for it, but it makes sense because it shows that you understand what's going on if you're showing the direction of the impulse there. Okay, and then you can see 4 marks for 4 labels, right? So there's the myelin sheath, the axon, right? And you can see in this case here of this diagram, the direction of the impulse is the other way, from left to right, because you've got the dendrites on the left-hand side and the axons on the right-hand side. Okay, they've got cell body, nucleus, cytoplasm, axon, any 4 of those there should have been there, right? Okay, and that brings us to the end of that question there, right? Which was to dealing with the reflex action and the reflex arc.